This is Fit to Succeed in partnership with NordicFitnessEducation.com with hosts Ben Pratt. Thanks for joining us.
I'm sorry to say that what the government tells us to eat, the starchy foods, base your meals on starchy foods, healthy so-called whole grains, they're pointless compared to real food. And it is just completely non-justifiable to continue to tell us to base our meals on these nutrient-poor foods when the nutrient-dense foods are available and are clear to be seen what we should be choosing.
Hello, Zoe Harcombe. This is a wonderful opportunity to have you join us here on the Fit to Succeed podcast. It's such a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, I am as well. Zoe, you and I go back quite a number of years and have had the opportunity to, discuss and interact in the concepts and topics around nutrition, health, and obesity. And however, I realized that wasn't where you started. You actually began your sort of interest in education in economics and maths, and then changed over time into a greater interest in diet and public health. What motivated you to make that change?
Yeah, very interesting actually. So I had what my mother would call a proper career in between doing maths and economics at Cambridge. And that was I started off in management consultancy because that was what people did when they left Cambridge at the time I was leaving Cambridge. It was that or investment banking, and I kind of never fancied investment banking. So had a normal career, ended up as a VP vice president for human resources for quite large areas, kind of like Europe, Middle East and Africa. So did really well, had a really, really good career, got to travel the world, really interesting organizations. Shock horror, I've worked for Mars, the candy company. Which is also,
no.
Yeah, exactly. But I worked in the electronics division. Not many people know that Mars has an electronics division,
All right.
the goal of which was to make vending machines so that people could buy chocolate and candy all day long. So
Right.
Mars was actually the first organization to come up with a vending machine. Not many people know that.
I didn't know that.
A reliable coin mechanism anyway. Then I went from candy to drugs, and I worked for SmithKline Beecham at around the time that it was going through the potential talks with Glaxo. And then, of course, they went through and it became GlaxoSmithKline. And then I moved to Wales for love, and I ended up working for the Welsh Development Agency, which helped me to travel the world, and Welsh Water and a telecoms company. So I've had a great HR career.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, it was incredible that it's 10 years ago, 2008, October, that the financial world fell apart, as a number of us will remember. And a number of us who were in proper jobs at the time got the opportunity in those proper jobs to take voluntary redundancy because many organizations were falling apart. And I was in one such organization, and a fantastic offer was put on the table, and there was hardly anyone left after they took this great opportunity. And I sat down with my husband and I said, look, I've been fascinated by obesity, diet, nutrition, why we have an obesity epidemic when nobody wants to be obese. It just doesn't make sense. It never made sense to me since I was at Cambridge looking around. It's never made sense. So I kind of wanted to make my passion my vocation. We had this opportunity which would help pave our way for a decent amount of time. So we seized the opportunity with both hands, and here we are 10 years later, making enough to put cat food in the bowl and dog food in the bowl also. So we're living the dream. We're not Rockefellers, but we're living the dream. So we're really happy.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's an interesting journey through some fairly senior corporate companies as well. But did you always then, you kind of alluded to having some interest back in when you were at school in Cambridge. Did you always have this interest in food and nutrition?
Yes, because I was here on the planet at the time that the dietary guidelines changed. So I remember things changing at home. I remember suddenly butter wasn't around. I mean, I was too young to work out entirely what was happening with mum, but I do remember spreads coming into our household, and we were supposed to be having these vegetable oil spreads, and there was less of eggs and bacon for breakfast, which had been, you know, pretty staple breakfast for us. And it seemed to be much more that we were having cereals. And then the milk changed, and my dad and I were no longer fighting over the nice creamy bit on the top of the milk anymore, because it wasn't there. There was, you know, it was coming in a carton that tasted like water. So I remember some of those changes when I was still at home and going off to school. And I went up to Cambridge, and as is so classic among high achieving females, I thought I was the only one having a really bad relationship with food. And I became the women's officer when I was up at my college, and I got some training from Central Cambridge to take back to my college. And I remember getting some training on women and eating disorders. And I remember looking at it thinking, wow, this is incredible. This is really talking to me, but nobody else in my college is going to be having this problem. You know, of that I'm sure. And we were only the second year that they admitted women into Corpus Christi, Cambridge. So there were only about 20 women in a college of about 200. And every one of those 20 women, when I said, I've got this information, you know, just on the off chance, and every single one of those women came to talk to me and said, I just got this terrible relationship with food. They were either hardly eating on the anorexia side of the spectrum, or they just couldn't stop eating on the compulsive eating side of the spectrum. There were various degrees of bulimia going on, people trying to eat and then purge or eat and then not eat, which is what I was doing. I was overeating some days and then trying not to eat anything to compensate the next day. That was sort of my preferred medium of trying to exercise control in those days. And I've just been fascinated by weight, obesity, and just why we have this problem when people just, you know, people would rather be slim than they'd rather anything else in the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just doesn't make sense.
Sorry, it's interesting that your background there came through the role of disordered eating, not personally so much yourself, although you've indicated that it was a means of controlling food intake, but to see that there was so many women in particular where you were, perhaps we could call high achieving women, who had a real poor relationship with food. Have you found that to be common in general as you've had this last 10 years in the nutrition industry?
Yes, and it was so helpful to go through that period. You know, I know I've had a couple of attacks on people who say, oh, you've had a mental illness or something. Yeah, I guess anorexia is a mental illness. And I did flirt with anorexia as a teenager, and then it sort of moved over into other things. And I was clearly not alone. And it clearly is something that happens with people in that profile group. How I can be blamed for the rest of my life for something that was going on when I was 16. I mean, that's just crazy. What it has done is it's given me firsthand experience and an invaluable insight into the relationship that people can have with food. So when I talk to people, male or female, women do tend to have a more extreme relationship with food. But when I talk to people in our online club about such kinds of things, they can tell that I know exactly what's going on. So if I do a 5-minute video on how to talk yourself out of a binge, what is going on at that moment when you're just about to overeat, and you know you're just about to overeat, and how can we intervene at that moment to stop it happening? I get so much feedback from people saying, I can tell you've been there. And I look at some government diet advisors who look like natural skinnies, and I just think, have you ever eaten less for one day, let alone tried it for 6 months? Have you ever got to the point that you were so hungry you couldn't fall asleep? Have you ever got to the point that you ate so much, your self-loathing had no boundaries? You don't understand what people are going through. You stand there and say, oh, just eat less, do more, like it's that easy.
Yeah, and it certainly isn't.
I just want to strangle them. And you get insights such as eating disorders are not about food. Food is the tool that is used, but anorexia particularly, and I think most eating disorders, the two key words that come to mind when you're talking about eating disorders are control and self-esteem. It's a desire to take control in a world where you feel out of control in some way. And for some people, tragically, that might have been because of abuse in their background, It might be just simply very controlling, very ambitious parents, and it's the child trying to kick back against that in some way. And the esteem is met because you have what you call a good day and you feel so virtuous, you feel so good, you get on the scales, they tell you you've done well. It's this immediate feedback of you've done well, you're a good girl, that perhaps you're not getting from quite critical people around you, whether that's parents or teachers or people, powers that be. And that's what eating disorders are about to me. They're about control and self-esteem, and knowing that you can help people to break out of the cycle and to help them realize it's not about food. It's just food is your chosen addiction. It could have been alcohol. It probably wouldn't be as a teenager. It probably would be as a 20, 30 something. It could be smoking. It could be exercise addiction. It could be lots of different things. You just happen to choose food, and that's okay. But let's now break the destructive pattern that you've got with food.
Yeah, and I think that gives us a great sort of background into your experience, but also you've set the tone on our need to improve our relationship with food. And I want us just to change direction slightly now as we kind of look to the bulk of what we want to discuss in this particular interview, which is the concept of using better quality food, real food, nutrient-dense foods to help us manage the way we feel about food, to manage our appetite, to manage obesity and things like that. So perhaps just to start this off in this direction, would you mind defining what you would interpret as a nutrient-dense food?
That's a good way of putting the question, actually, because there are different interpretations. So I've seen different definitions of nutrient density. As a general principle, nutrient density means how much nutrition you get for a particular measure. So I like to think of it as the bang that we get for the buck. But the measure can vary. So the nutrition part should focus on essential nutrients. And in nutrition, when we use the word essential, we mean something that we must consume. There are things that are essential, such as cholesterol, but we don't actually have to consume cholesterol. It is so essential that the body actually makes us for us. Yeah. But there are some things that we must consume. So we must consume certain vitamins, 13 vitamins, approximately 16 to 20 minerals. We must consume the essential fatty acids, omega-3, omega-6, and we must consume complete protein in our diet. So I think the best definitions of nutrient density are where they look at those essential nutrients and then say how much of those essential nutrients does a particular food have relative to a particular measure. Now, the measure that I like to use is raw weight before something is cooked. Because the minute we start cooking food, you change the nutrient density, you change the nutrient availability. So if we take 100 grams of, for example, oily fish versus broccoli or versus flour, what nutrients could we get for that 100 grams? We could also look at nutrient density per 100 calories or per a certain number of calories. And we could also look at it as a typical portion, although that's much more subjective then.
I would say the calories one is the one I've come across most, where it's the amount of nutrition per calories. But yeah, it's I like the idea that it's per weight. Does that therefore mean that to get a higher nutrient dense food, a food must be lower in calories?
It doesn't necessarily mean that at all. So you can work out nutrient density, and it's something that I love to do. And some of the most popular slides when I present at conferences, you could tell the popular ones nowadays because everyone holds up the phone and takes a photo of it.
Yes, that's true.
and the ones that get photographed the most in my presentations are when I put up a slide of nutrient density. So I take foods that I know to be absolutely phenomenal for nutrients on any measure you want to pick. And that would be things like offal. I use liver as the most typical example. Oily fish, I take sardines, ideally sardines with the bones and the skin on, so you get in as much of the bone nutrients as you can, vitamin D, calcium, phosphorus. Sunflower seeds are also a very, very important food because looking at nutrients, you then start to realize, how could you get vitamin E without sunflower seeds? If you look at how much vitamin E comes in sunflower seeds versus how much comes typically in other foods, it can be a ratio of 20 to 30 to 1. It's quite a unique provider of one particular vitamin. And then, of course, you look at what our dear governments tell us to eat, which is fruit, 5 a day. That's a myth, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Healthy whole grains, ho, ho, ho. And I've got stuff on my site. If people want to go to zoeharcombe.com and put in healthy whole grains in the search box, it will bring up an open blog that takes the nutrient density of things like liver, sardines, sunflower seeds, and then compares it with whole wheat flour or whole wheat pasta. I can't remember the exact grains that I've used.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at it per 100 grams, and I highlight things in red so that you can see particularly very, very quickly which item wins on retinol, which wins on B2, which wins on vitamin C. So you can just look across quickly. And at a glance, you can then see that liver wins on virtually everything. It just wins on virtually everything, which is why you just need such a little amount of liver in your diet on a daily or a weekly basis. That's why Granny was right to say once a week you can have a decent portion of liver and onions, and that's going to give you the fat-soluble vitamins, particularly retinol, for the rest of the week. You then don't need to worry about your daily intake. The B vitamins are phenomenal. One of my favorite little food factoids is that liver by weight actually has 4 times the vitamin C of an apple.
Wow, that's great. It is a good source for sure.
Not many people know that, but when you look, so you can look at liver either by 100 grams, or if I'm looking now and liver is 116 calories per 100 grams, whole wheat flour is almost 3 times the calories per 100 grams.
Right.
Now, whole wheat flour is already being beaten into the ground by liver just per 100 grams.
Right.
So if we want to do it by 100 calories, then we're going to divide the nutrients in the whole wheat flour column by 3. And I tell you, most of them are 0.3, 0.2, 0, 0, 0, 0 already. Divide them by 3 and whole wheat flour is just pointless. And relative to nutrient-dense food, I'm sorry to say that what the government tells us to eat, the starchy foods, base your meals on starchy foods, healthy so-called whole grains, they're pointless compared to real food. And it is just completely non-justifiable to continue to tell us to base our meals on these nutrient-poor foods when the nutrient-dense foods are available and are clear to be seen what we should be choosing.
There's a thought that comes from that, Zoe, which is interesting, which is you mentioned things like apples and using either white or whole wheat flour to cook with. And you know, I totally agree with you on the nutrient density front, but I can see many people would say, but the taste of liver compared to eating nice bread or eating a delicious apple, you know, there's a real issue for adherence. You know, how would you potentially overcome that?
I totally agree. I hate liver. I absolutely hate it. I know it is the most nutritious food on the planet. I know olives are really nutritious. I hate olives as well.
Oh, really?
But if you want to look at the foods that you do like and then look at the nutrient density for those. So if, for example, you like oily fish, if you like when you go on holiday and you have the local catch of the day, or if you can find some responsibly sourced salmon, that's probably better than tuna because that's getting really quite scarce now. If you can find local sea bass, as we can in Wales, and if you then compare that to healthy whole grains, so-called, you'll see that the nutrient density is in the fish. And if you like cheese, or you like whole natural yogurt, or you like milk in a cappuccino with some cocoa powder dusting on top, and you look at, for example, the nutrient density of cocoa powder, which for anyone who likes dark chocolate as I do, that is so exciting.
It is.
Cocoa powder just is such a rich source of minerals. So it's fantastic for iron, zinc, copper, manganese, magnesium, absolutely phenomenal. It will beat most lentils, pulses, any whole grains for those minerals that come from the ground. So you can then just make better choices. Now, I love fruit. I'm not an LCHF person. You know, my diet is lower in carb and higher in fat than the government would like, but it's a lot higher in carb and lower in fat than anyone that I meet at LCHF conferences.
Right. So the low carb, high fat conferences, just to clarify.
Yeah. So I love apples, particularly in the autumn in the UK. I love English autumn apples. I like berries. I pick blackberries so that I can eat them on Christmas Day, stick them in the freezer and get them out when I want to. I don't limit veg in any way. I'll have a croissant if I'm skiing and it just looks absolutely irresistible, dripping in butter. I'll enjoy veggie curry and brown rice. I'll enjoy porridge, baked potatoes. You know, I'm pretty cool about what I eat, but it tends to be food in the form in which it comes closest to that which you'd find in the natural world.
Yeah, fantastic. It's a concept that I hold close to my heart, and something that I do a lot when I prepare food is try to minimize the amount of processing and to maximize the closeness, like you said, with which it is in the natural world before we cook it. Yeah. Now, there's many foods, by the way, Zoe, that are marketed as healthy today. And you've kind of touched on some, things like whole wheat flour, for example. But, there are many other things that we could think about, for example, health food bars or breakfast cereals, fruit smoothies. Do you have any thoughts or concerns as to these foods that are, inverted commas, referred to as healthy foods in relation to their nutrient density or ability to help people manage their weight?
Yes, because most of them are fortified in some way.
Right.
And if you ever see a fortified product, if I can use the word crap, you know that it's crap.
Yeah.
Because if it were really healthy, it wouldn't need to be fortified.
But they use the word fortified as though it's a marketing. This is great.
Exactly. Look. Yeah, it's like, Popeye standing there with all his muscles popping out. Look, I'm fortified. I'm really strong or whatever. It's like, I call these things high calorie vitamin tablets. It's like, okay, if you don't want to eat oily fish, if you don't want to eat liver, if you don't want to eat red meat, whatever your personal preferences are, if you know you're not getting the nutrients that you require from real food, then take a vitamin supplement. But you don't have to take a high calorie vitamin supplement, which is what fortified cereal is, or what a cereal bar is, or, milk, it gets fortification in some places, in some ways. Just eat the whole milk and stop eating the skim stuff, and then you won't need to try to look for your vitamin D or vitamin A somewhere else. So these just don't compare with real foods. And just to mention on the smoothie one, the real form in which fruit comes is, of course, with skin on. Imagine it, how it would come off the tree in the field. That's how we should be eating fruit if we're going to eat fruit. And as Gary Toad says, if you're overweight, then fruit is not your friend. So if you want to eat fruit, bear in mind that it is pretty much just sugar with a few vitamins and minerals, nowhere near as many as you might expect. It really isn't nutrient dense compared to other foods. But whatever you do, eat the whole fruit if you're going to eat fruit. Don't put it in a juicer. Don't put it in a smoothie, because you can have the equivalent of 10 pieces of fruit in about 5 minutes. And the sugar hit that you will get is quite astronomical. It's just not healthy. It's unbelievably sweet. And you must know that it's basically candy from just how sweet this stuff is. Don't kid yourself if you eat fruit that it's good for you. Eat it if you enjoy it, but don't kid yourself it's good for you.
Yeah, one of the things I often have talked about with people is that if you think about what is the purpose of fruit in the life cycle of a plant, it's there to attract an animal or a human to eat it, so that you will then help spread the seed around so it can grow its seed somewhere else. It's not really there to be a nutritious tool. It's there to be a survival tool for the plant. And I think when you think like that, it's like, well, why wouldn't you make it as exciting and as tasty as possible? Which, of course, is what happens in lots of cheap food marketing as well.
Yeah, and it's also there typically in the autumn, heading up to winter. So in medieval times in the UK, we would have been intended to eat all the apples, all the pears that we could get our hands on, and then pretty much all fruit in the UK has gone by December, January. So we use the fruit, the berries, the pears, the apples, stuff that's indigenous to our part of the world. We use that to fatten up for winter. So that we get through the winter period. We're now having pineapples imported from the Caribbean on Christmas Day and wondering why it's making us fat.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other bits of research on fruit that I came across was when you study the Hunza people, who are people in North Pakistan, people always seem to refer to the Hunza as being people who loved apricots, and obviously apricots are very high in sugar, and they dried them in the summer months. But what tended to happen there, the fault there was that people who've traveled to that remote part of the world only traveled in the summertime when the apricots were all in obviously fruiting and coming through. But in the wintertime, they really struggled. There was very little fruit and vegetables to eat throughout the winter, and apricots was not on the diet at that time of year. So it's an interesting one. I think fruit can be good, but it's a seasonal food, and we should because we have global summertime in the supermarkets, we do tend to maybe overeat them. What would you say, Zoe, are the metabolic problems that are created when people eat a low nutrient dense diet? I know I've just opened a can of worms there and we don't have too much time left, but what concerns are there if our diet is too high in calories and too low in nutrients?
So the main one, I think, is the impact on blood glucose. And I think that the other issues then stem from that. So if you look at things that would define the metabolic syndrome, for example, high triglycerides in the bloodstream, abdominal obesity particularly, but can be obesity generally, predisposition towards type 2 diabetes, if not already pre-diabetic, type 2 diabetic. And all of that comes from the immediate impact on blood glucose. So we eat low nutrient density foods. They just have to be high in carbohydrate. I mean, that's all that needs to happen for us to have this massive blood glucose hit. So it's anything that contains carbohydrate, and particularly the foods that are predominantly carbohydrate. And of course, the only foods that don't contain carbohydrate are pure fats and meat and fish. Eggs have got barely a trace of carbohydrate, so you can think of those as carbohydrate free, but then everything else, everything in the plant world, dairy products, they've all got a carbohydrate content. So if you do what the government tells you to do, which is to base your meals on starchy foods, consume at least 55% of your diet in the form of carbohydrate, you are putting this massive, unprecedented, historically alien amount of carbohydrate into a human body, something that we simply have not evolved to cope with. And the entire bloodstream contains 1 teaspoon of glucose at any one time, 4 grams of glucose at any one time. So eat 1 apple, which might have 12 grams of glucose. You've tripled the amount of blood glucose that you should have in your system at any one time. So the body might only have needed half a gram. You might have been very slightly dipping below the normal level, in which case the body would have dealt with it by breaking down body fat or breaking down any stored carbohydrates. The body's got a mechanism for getting you back to that 4 gram level. But every time we eat carbohydrates, and not only does the government tell us to eat carbohydrates, they tell us to eat carbohydrates little and often. So graze, snack, eat carbohydrates all day long. And I think the blood glucose epidemic that we're facing at the moment is essentially the body saying enough is enough. I used to be able to cope with a bit of sugar in the autumn in the form of whole fruit. I never got these cereal bars. I never got cereals. I never got cakes, cookies, snacks, crisps, ice cream. I never got all this other stuff that you're chucking into me every 2 hours. And enough is enough. I can keep to 4 grams of glucose when you eat properly. But when you eat in the way that you're eating right now, you are quite frankly disrespecting me as your body mechanism. And up yours. I can't do it anymore. Enough's enough.
Yeah, sure. And, I think that's a well-versed problem in the modern Western world. There's no doubt. Now, the opposite of that, which you kind of alluded to earlier when you talked about a tendency to edge towards a lower carbohydrate, higher fat diet yourself, even though you're not afraid of eating carbohydrate, it leads to the other side of this, which is perhaps the contrasting side, which is that, you're quite an advocate for scientifically validated natural fats in the diet. Now, I've become aware, and I'm sure you have, Zoe, that over the last few years, there's a number of isolated oils that have been really heavily promoted in the nutrition circles. Over the last 20 years, olive oil has become the oil of choice. Coconut oil in the last maybe 5 or 6 years has really started to take over. We're seeing it in many of the supermarkets now. And other foods like ghee and butter. Now, these are isolated fats in most cases. And clearly, if we were to apply the concept of nutrient density to them, they are very, very high in calorie, but are they not relatively low in nutrition? What's your thoughts on these isolated fats?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. So I'm an advocate for real food. And quite interestingly, there is actually no real food that comes in the form of pure fat. So the real food is olives. Olive oil is actually a highly concentrated derivative from olives. And again, the real food is coconut. Coconut oil is a highly concentrated derivative from the real food that is the coconut.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at things like milk and cheese in the dairy world, they're far more nutrient dense than butter. So I recommend that people cook with natural fats, such as olive oil being more saturated and monounsaturated than it is polyunsaturated. That's going to be safer for cooking. Butter and coconut oil would be safer for cooking still.
Mm-hmm.
But I've got major concerns, and I've written about such concerns that I have with people in the low carb, high fat world, adding fat to food, and I always sort of put this in inverted commas, for the sake of it. And it's just not helping people in the LCHF world who still have obesity as a problem that they're trying to address. So where I see adding fat to meals working well is when you're dining with people like Professor Steve Phinney or Professor Tim Noakes, and these guys are super slim, addressing type 2 diabetes in their own experience, and they need to add fat to meals to get enough energy so that they can actually function as human beings, so that they don't waste away, and they don't want to add carbohydrate, obviously, because of the blood glucose issue. They don't even want to go too high in protein, because while protein doesn't have an impact on blood glucose, it does have an impact on insulin.
It does.
So to manage their own type 2 diabetes without wasting away, they need to add fat to food. But I sit next to people at conferences. My husband is with me. He's 6 foot tall. He's, you could hardly grab an inch anyway. He's a perfect specimen. Obviously, I'm biased. But he's not adding butter to the meal. We have this fabulous meal that might be roast lamb with vegetables. There might be some berries and cream for pudding. It's completely satiating. It will get you through to the next meal. Absolutely no problem whatsoever. And we're sat next to people who are still morbidly obese, who are adding 50, 100 grams of butter to their meal. And
which is huge amounts of calories, isn't it?
Yeah, and you are absolutely right when you say it's just not that nutritious. I mean, go on nutritiondata.com, which is the United States Department of Agriculture All Foods database. That's the one I'm on all the time. Love it.
Yeah, I use it too. It's great.
Yeah, go and put in butter. It's got a couple of the fat-soluble vitamins. It's got none of the B vitamins, none of the water-soluble vitamins, obviously, because it doesn't contain water. It's got no minerals. It's got no protein. It's just not that nutrient dense.
And the same with coconut oil. You have a look at coconut oil, and it's almost completely lacking in any nutrition whatsoever. It's just pure fat and energy.
Yeah. I think people need to take care. If you need it to get through to the next meal because you're skinny and type 2 diabetic, then use it. If you don't, if you're still trying to manage a weight problem, you've really got to start asking, why are you adding butter to food?
I think that's a great point that people should recognize here, and that is that everybody is a different internal landscape. If somebody has a disorder such as type 2 diabetes, their body and their system doesn't work the way a normal healthy person's body does, and so the way they should eat should vary. It should differ, and therefore we must be careful not to apply, I guess, in many ways, like you've indicated, Zoe, that the government just applies a one-size-fits-all approach. It will differ based on people's differing needs, and we need to be mindful of that.
Yeah.
All right. Perhaps as time is upon us, maybe I could just ask one final thought. All right. If you you've now reached the end of your life, sorry to be morbid, but if you could determine the legacy of dietary knowledge that you were to be remembered for, Dr. Zoe Harcombe, what single concept would you wish the world to know?
Okay, so the single concept that I would love the world to know, and I just throw out every piece of dietary advice other than this, is just a 3-word message, which is eat real food.
Yay.
I'm not alone in saying that. So in terms of the personal legacy that I'd like to leave, I like to think I've made a contribution in 3 areas. One, I think I'm the person who's attacked the eat badly plate, and I coined that phrase. So what the government calls the eat well plate, I call it the eat badly plate. I think I've attacked that more than anyone else. If you go on zoeharcombe.com and put in the word eat well, you'll get some great blogs there where I've attacked it. If anyone's attacked it more than me, I want to know, because I would love to shake their hand.
You've been a real battle cry on that one, I tell you.
Yeah. The second one is attacking the 3,500 calorie theory. And again, if anyone wants to see my demolition of that from quite a few years ago, on my site, put in the words in the search box, prove it. And a blog will come up saying the 3,500 calorie theory, prove it or stop using it. And none of them can prove it. So that's a great fun blog. And then I remember my PhD supervisor saying to me, at the end of your PhD, you should actually be the global expert on your PhD topic, whether that's the reproduction of rabbits in the countryside, or in my case, the evidence base for the dietary fat guidelines that were introduced in 1977 in the US and 1983 in the UK, and that we should eat no more than 10% of our diet in the form of saturated fat and no more than 30% of our diet in the form of total fat. And I like to think I'm up there in people who know the evidence base, or rather the lack of evidence base, as it turned out, for those two dietary fat guidelines. So essentially, there was no evidence for those to be introduced, and they have driven the high carbohydrate advice, because if you tell people not to eat fat, they've got to eat something, and carbohydrate then fills that void. So eat real food, but hopefully I've added a couple of original contributions somewhere along the way.
Oh, for sure. You definitely have. And, many of those great topics are in your book, The Obesity Epidemic, which I thoroughly enjoyed when I read it some years ago. Is your PhD, have you got it published on your website?
It's published. It's for site subscribers, unfortunately.
Right. Okay. No worries. I can understand that.
That's how I live, really. So I do a newsletter each Monday morning. I've been doing one since 2009, which is a bit of a chalice around your neck, because even on Christmas Day, you're trying to work out when the next Monday is. the latest dissection.
Of course.
But my obesity book is on there. The PhD is on there, and sort of videos when I speak at conferences, they're on there.
Fantastic.
Well,
I would certainly encourage the listeners to go to Zoe's site and subscribe. There's so much great information, and she's always a great well of knowledge. Zoe, it's been such a pleasure having you on today. I really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share via social media. You can also rate the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. If you'd like to know more about us, then check out our range of online courses at www.nordicfitnesseducation.com.